Hello, everybody. It is my distinct honor today to introduce to you our afternoon's keynote speaker, Bob Krueger. Bob Krueger is Hathaway Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And he's also one of the two editors of the Journal of Personality Disorders. He finished his PhD in 1996 working with Terry Moffitt at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And the topic of his PhD thesis was how personality traits and psychopathology interrelate. And that's a topic that has kept him busy ever since, I would say. I would say, and I hope you agree, he's not so much interested, according to my view, in the particular details of specific disorders, but much more in the broad picture of how the personality realm relates to the psychopathology realm. On his website, he says that he's interested in deriving empirically based models for the individual difference domains that underlie tendencies to develop psychopathology. And if you are doing that, if you are aiming at empirically based models, you inevitably will come into conflict with more traditional views of how psychopathology needs to be classified. Bob Krueger was on the work group that worked on the revision of the DSM-5 classification of personality disorders. And as a part of that process, he had to, of course, confront the more traditional viewpoints of how psychopathology, personality pathology has to be classified. If you're interested in reading about that, I highly recommend his 2013 paper titled Personality Disorders Are the Vanguard of the post-DSM 5.0 era. It's very revealing, gives you a lot of kind of inside information about the processes within such work groups. Very interesting to read. Today he's going to talk about the PID-5, which is the abbreviation of the Personality Inventory for DSM-5. And the PID-5 is a measure of the newly adopted how do you call it? The maladaptive traits and trait facets that feature in the Chapter 3 alternative proposal for PD diagnostics in the new DSM-5 manual. And I'm personally very grateful to Bob Krueger because he's probably the main responsible person for incorporating a view on personality pathology that is in line with basic personality research. That's really something new. Personality pathology in DSM-4 was classified in complete independence of anything that has ever been done in basic personality research. And since DSM-5 and the introduction of the new alternative proposal, we now have an explicit bridge, a link to basic personality psychology in the form of these maladaptive traits and facets that relate directly to the Big Five model of personality. The PID-5, which is going to be the focus of today's talk, is a tool that's devised to make these maladaptive traits and facets measurable. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Thank you for being with us, and I'm very excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good, okay. Well, good afternoon. I appreciate all of you attending this lecture today. I want to thank the organizers, first of all, for this wonderful meeting and for the invitation to come to this wonderful city. It's been terrific. I've been to the French-speaking part of Switzerland, but never to the German-speaking part. So it's exciting to see Zurich. It's such a beautiful city, and I really very much appreciate that. Invitation also to Daniel for his kind words about the work that we've tried to do. And thanks to Daniel for all of his work with Johannes Zimmermann translating the PID-5 into German, which has been a great thing to be involved with. So also an apology to people who've seen similar talks from me. There was a request that I speak specifically about DSM-5, as Daniel said, and I've given similar talks at similar meetings. So I apologize to people who've heard some of this before. But I do promise some new molecular genetic data toward the end of this that I'm very excited about, so that there's at least a little bit of something that's different and new. In any case, as Daniel suggested, to explain kind of what we've been up to for the past few years, you really do need to start with the DSM-4 paradigm, this traditional categorical perspective on what psychopathology is. So traditionally in psychiatry, mental disorders are polythetic dichotomies, and I'll explain more about what I mean by those terms, that are created by committees of clinician experts. So by polythetic, I mean that many combinations of symptoms can lead to the same categorical label, right? It's less about which particular symptoms a person has. It's more about the exact number of symptoms that they have, given this kind of approach to thinking about mental illnesses. A typical example out of the DSM-4 would be something like, there are 9 symptoms listed, and a patient needs to have at least 5 of them to have the disorder. And the polythetic word means it doesn't matter which 5. It could be any of these 5. They're fungible. They're exchangeable with each other in terms of how they contribute to the diagnostic concept. And all of the personality disorders in DSM-4 were defined in this manner. And by dichotomy, I mean the idea in psychiatry traditionally has been that the patient either has the diagnosis or doesn't. There are no grades of severity, right? Either you're above the threshold or below it. An example would be if you're having 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 of the symptoms, then you are a case of personality disorder. But should you be fortunate enough to have 4, then you're not a case of personality disorder. If you have 4 or less, then you don't have the personality disorder. So again, 2 key features of the paradigm that came before the work that we tried to do in DSM-5 was this idea of things being polythetic and dichotomous in this fashion. And as you can imagine, as a group of people who study assessment, there are very serious problems with this model and almost no empirical support for it. It derives more from this clinical tradition in psychiatry of observing patients and then describing what they're like without using data or quantitative methods to understand the organization of the things that you're seeing in the clinic. So one major problem is comorbidity. In fact, the typical patient who meets criteria for at least one of the DSM-4 personality disorders meets criteria for others. And again, I emphasize the typical patient. So by that I mean the modal typical patient who walks in the door. If they have one of these things per the DSM-4 system, they will have at least 2 more on average, right? So when people have studied this, oftentimes we see 3 diagnoses in persons who are supposed to have 1. That makes it very difficult to conceptualize clinical cases in terms of these 10 dichotomies or diagnoses in the DSM-4 system. Those thresholds I referred to, 5 of 9, for example, are entirely arbitrary. There's no basis for setting them at 5 as opposed to 4 or 3. In fact, when I inquired with people about how were those set in DSM-4, the only answer I could get is that it seemed reasonable to set them at around more than half, because that's kind of easy to remember, right? If there's 9 things and you have 5, you can kind of remember that. That's the extent to which there's any kind of basis for saying that there should be 5. So there's no empirical basis for that. There's a great deal of heterogeneity within the categories, and that stems from the polythetic nature of their construction, right? So if it doesn't matter which 5 of 9 you have, a bunch of different combinations, right? So you can do the permutations. You can do the mathematics to figure out the combinations. Many different combinations can lead to the same level or the same diagnosis. And so you get a diversity of presentation in what are supposed to be coherent groups. In the DSM-4, these 10 disorders that it describes as personality disorders are organized into 3 broader groupings. That has no basis either. There's no reason to think that those 3 groupings make any sense. And so as a result of these problems, saying personality disorder not otherwise specified, which is an alternative you have in the DSM system, the DSM-4 system, if you don't have one of those 10, you can say the patient has a personality disorder, but it's not specified, it's something else. That often, I think, is the correct diagnosis in that system, right? So you'll hear people complain that frontline clinicians are using these NOS diagnoses too frequently, and they should be taught the system better. But I think instead what frontline clinicians are seeing is people who don't fit into these categories. And if you don't fit, then you're supposed to use this NOS category. So this is frequently used. And again, my take on this is that it's because people don't fit into the 10 categories. Another problem, more from a research angle, is that discrete representations of psychopathology variables and manifest representations. So by that I mean if you did a research study and you created a variable where you said, okay, 0 means you don't have the diagnosis, 1 means you do have the diagnosis, and then you try to correlate that variable with something else, right, as opposed to having some more continuous variable, that has a substantial impact on decreasing reliability and validity. So my former student, Christian Marcon, did a paper in the Psychological Bulletin that shows this unequivocally based on a great deal of data for psychopathology. If you have a discrete representation of, say, depression, as opposed to a continuous representation, you lose a ton of power and reliability and validity. So another possibility, though, is that the underlying distribution, what you might call in statistics the latent distribution, is discrete in spite of the manifest distribution having different properties. So people have tried things like this too, right? Things like Paul Meehl's taxometric methods, things like finite mixture modeling, right? Various kinds of quantitative approaches to see if sitting underneath what we see clinically are some categories. And there's very little evidence for that as well, right? So when people have applied these sophisticated methods, there's no evidence for discrete variation in personality pathology. So then the question, that we tend to ask, or that I think about a lot, is if we were to propose a dimensional alternative, could it take us someplace where we want to go, right? So I think that's the way to counter these categorical traditions, right? So for example, what is it that we're trying to do, or what are we trying to understand about psychopathology? So speaking for myself, one thing that I've always been very interested in are the underlying biological correlates of individual differences. So in a lot of my work, especially before being involved in the DSM, I focused a lot on genetic kind of research. So I've always been very interested in the idea of understanding the genetic basis of human variation and did a lot of research like that. And so one angle on why one might want to think more dimensionally is because it will help us to understand the biological correlates of mental disorders. So that's a case that I'd like to try to make, for you today. So as Daniel suggested, we did make some headway in working on DSM-5. The DSM-5 now contains an alternative model of personality disorders called the alternative model. But that's important, right? This was actually, I can say much, much more about the politics and would be glad to talk about it. But that language is very interesting. It took a lot of backroom deals to get that language in there because the intention was to say, this is a legitimate alternative to the traditional approach, right? So if you are on the front lines, you have a choice, right? You can listen to pop music or you can use the alternative music, right? That kind of was the idea, right? It's a legitimate alternative to what other people are doing. So the alternative model that's in DSM-5 is different from the traditional model for various reasons. One aspect of it is that you can it was based on building quantitative models from observable signs and symptoms and using those models to describe concepts you might want to use as a clinician. This is more of an inductive empirical approach, right? So this is different scientifically from the way that clinical medicine has typically worked. Throughout much of the 20th century, physicians were very fortunate to be studying, I think, disorders that when biological technologies became available, the underlying pathophysiology, right, the causes of those things ended up being pretty manageable or tractable, right? So I can think of examples like sickle cell anemia and so on, right, where the underlying biology was something you could see under a microscope. You didn't need particularly sophisticated methods to understand the etiology and the pathophysiology. Behavioral disorders, however, seem very different. They have not yielded to this kind of approach. It hasn't been as easy as seeing a small number of cases of a particular disorder, calling it, Bob's disorder or whatever, and then trying to understand the underlying biology based on looking under a microscope at blood, for example. This has not worked for complex conditions like schizophrenia and depression and so on. So I do think we need an alternative approach, and I would argue for the approach that psychologists, especially assessment-oriented psychologists such as yourselves, have typically taken, which is to work from basic observations up toward the concepts that we want to use in our science. So I would argue that the alternative model provides a key step in moving in this direction. And I'll tell you guys a little bit about it today. Criterion A in this model indexes the overall extent of personality pathology, And Criterion B in this model contains specifiers that are meant to enhance the case conceptualization. It also provides a way of working backwards to DSM-4 style content, right? So, and there have been a number of studies like this now that have shown clearly that you can take what's in the alternative model and reverse engineer the classical concepts, right? So to my way of thinking, that's important, right? If you move toward a dimensional system, it would be useful for the system to be able to recreate what was there before it. So that's something that I think it's capable of doing, producing high-fidelity reproduction of DSM-4 concepts. It also helps in delineating what you might call the metastructure of psychopathology. And by that I mean psychopathology writ large, larger than just the personality disorders, right? So many of the concepts described in the DSM are, to my way of thinking, and also based on data, manifestations of personality tendencies under certain sorts of circumstances, right? So depression is not something that's independent of personality. It's something that people experience when their personality structure encounters stressors in their environment that then lead them to be depressed. So many of those concepts that are traditionally on axis 1 are manifestations of personality in an important sense. And by putting this kind of stuff in the DSM, that connection can be realized. So by the metastructure, I mean the organization of chapters and other broad classificatory rubrics, right, ways of classifying things. And I think this also helps us to recognize how personality dispositions underlying psychopathology can serve as compelling treatment targets. So traditionally, there's this idea that you can't treat personality, but I think that's fundamentally misleading about what personality is and how it works. Right? What we've learned when we've studied personality empirically is that it's much more dynamic than we originally thought, right? There's some evidence, of course, for consistency across time in people's personalities, but there's also evidence within any longitudinal data set for people who are changing. And when we can get a better handle on what those changes are about, I think we have a way then of thinking about what are the things that happen in people's lives that do cause their personalities to be different from time to time. Okay, so more about how the alternative model works. Criterion A describes self and interpersonal dysfunction. Self-dysfunction is basically, does the person have a coherent sense of who they are and where they're going in life? And interpersonal functioning is the patient able to interact successfully with others? So this is a recognition of a long clinical tradition that really goes back to Freud in a lot of ways of thinking about what are the major tasks of adult life and what kinds of mechanisms do you need, right, in a personality to pursue those tasks successfully. And the idea in this kind of approach is to say that's kind of the essence of what personality pathology is. It's about this kind of functioning, right? There's some basis for saying the personality isn't functioning well, and that shows up as the person has an incoherent sense of who they are and what they're trying to do. And that's related to problems that the person has in conceptualizing other people coherently and being able to interact successfully. Then Criterion B, which is more the part that I worked on, has to do with maladaptive personality specifiers. So these are descriptions of particular personality problems. We would be comfortable calling these things traits, but the word trait has a lot of baggage in this world, so let's call them specifiers so physicians can be comfortable with these concepts. So they would be examples like being manipulative, being unusually callous, being unusually suspicious, and so on. The alternative model also includes a concept called personality disorder trait specified, and that's a new idea in the DSM. Recall in the DSM-4 system that if you didn't fit in a particular category, you had a personality disorder not otherwise specified. So the idea here was to say most presentations can be specified if you have a reasonably flexible model for describing them. So personality disorder trait specified says use the trait system, the Criterion B elements, to describe the particular configuration that's characteristic of this person. And that incorporates the understanding that personality is multidimensional. And by that I mean the difficulty with the categories is that people don't fit in them, and so then how do you have a system that actually works? Well, it's the sort of thing that assessment psychologists have been familiar with from instruments like the MMPI, the WAIS, and so on, that people have different profiles of scores across a series of dimensions, and that describes individual differences, right? So it's that tradition now being imported, if you will, into a psychiatric diagnostic manual. And as I mentioned before, you can also use this to get back to the DSM-4 categories, right? So you can have particular combinations of features here to describe all the classical content that you need to describe. If you want to describe borderline personality disorder, for example, well, that's a specific set of features that combine in a specific way. The same thing with antisocial or schizoid or whatever your favorite, classical category might happen to be. So in giving this kind of presentation, I think it's very important to recognize the history of these ideas, right? So speaking for myself, these are some key figures that have had a big impact on my thinking. And I want to do this because I think it's important to show that there's a lineage here, right? This isn't something that came sort of out of the blue, right? This is sort of an idea that's been sitting there, and hopefully what we managed to do with DSM-5 catalyzes this tradition, right? So takes this tradition and now applies it, at least in this sort of world of American psychiatry. So Al Harkness and his colleague McNulty at the University of Tulsa have worked on this problem for a long time and pointed out that there really are these 5 broad maladaptive domains that underlie a lot of personality pathology, and that you can use instruments like the MMPI to study those domains. Leanna Clark and David Watson are good friends of mine, and they've worked on this for many years. How structural models of temperament can be interwoven with personality disorder features, thereby showing how temperament is the glue that holds together a lot of psychopathology. John Livesley is a very interesting character in all of this, right? So John was trained originally really as a differential psychologist in the British tradition. But after receiving his PhD in that area, he went on to medical school. So he's sort of an interloper, right? This word is, sort of someone who's secretly something other than what you think they are, right? So he's a psychiatrist who actually understands psychometrics and so on. So his work, I think, has been very useful in being able to speak with psychiatry about, these kinds of methods. Tom Whittaker and Paul Costa have come at this problem from the angle of the normative 5-factor model, right? Saying that the kind of thing that's measured by the NEO instruments, for example, can also be applied to understanding personality pathology. And of course, I think this discussion would be incomplete without mentioning Hans Ising, right? The great British differential psychologist, whose story is similar in the sense that, he was trained in things like psychometrics but ended up working at a mental hospital, and that's what led to some of the early instruments, right, that he had developed, right? So the situation was similar, I think, for Ising, in that he was trained in these things, and people were talking about Jungian kinds of concepts, and it occurred to him that you could measure these things, and you could have an instrument to try to study them, and that led to, extroversion, neuroticism, and that kind of model, that Penn model that ultimately Ising developed. Okay. So then a little more detail about Criterion B, which again I would argue comes from this tradition, from this lineage of differential psychology. One way of explaining this to clinicians that I think has been very effective, at least for me when I've given presentations to people who are on the clinical front lines, is to think of this as a review of systems. So physicians don't just diagnose categorical diseases. A good physician will also review the functioning of major systems when you go in for a consultation, right? So in addition to your presenting complaint, like I'm here because because I'm having GI problems or whatever you're there for, the person should think also about the functioning of other systems, like how is the neurological system functioning in addition to the GI system, even if your complaint is about how your gastrointestinal system is working. So this metaphor works well, I think, in talking about this with clinicians. It's not just that you want to assign a diagnosis, you also want to review functioning in multiple systems. And those systems then, not surprisingly, are maladaptive versions of the well-known 5 factors. So negative affect as opposed to emotional stability, detachment as opposed to extroversion, antagonism as opposed to agreeableness, disinhibition as opposed to conscientiousness, and psychoticism as opposed to lucidity. So the way that I've tried to communicate these ideas with clinicians is that these are broad rubrics, organizing ways of thinking about particular patients. And of course, each domain, as we know, contains more specific facets or finer-grained elements that help to flesh out the psychological content of the broader domains. For example, manipulativeness and callousness are facets of antagonism. So those things help to be able to differentiate in a more fine-grained way what a particular patient is like. And I and other people have found that when you give seminars with clinicians about this, that they tend to find, and I'll describe these to you in a moment, the facets, these very fine-grained elements of personality, to be one of the more useful parts of this system, because clinically you can describe a person in a good deal of detail using these fine-grained elements. Okay. So again, the idea is that the 5 domains delineate systems that help you to focus on case conceptualization in this way. And Al Harkness has a paper that I would recommend to anybody who's interested in this way of approaching it, a really nice paper. And it's similar to the review of systems in clinical medicine. So when you think about this clinically, like what is a patient like, how do you use this system, you can describe negative affect, which is this broad domain of neuroticism that's been studied at least since Leising. Does the patient experience frequent and diverse unpleasant emotional disturbances, or is she calm, cool, and collected? And how do we think clinically about introversion extroversion? Well, in the DSM-5 system, it emphasizes the maladaptive low pole of this dimension, right? And therefore, it's called detachment, because the idea is that it's more pathological than just introversion, right? It goes beyond, I prefer not to attend parties, more into the realm of, I cannot experience pleasure from my encounters with other people, right? So it gets a little darker, if you will. So does the patient engage socially, or is she withdrawn? Antagonism, does the person sort of play well with others, right? Can the person get along well with other people, or do they turn all interpersonal encounters into some battle in which they're trying to manipulate or win, or sort of, treat the other person badly or without regard to their feelings? Disinhibition, does the person meet obligations, or is she careless or impulsive? And then this domain of psychoticism, right? And so this is an interesting puzzle, how psychoticism relates to the normal range domain of openness, and maybe I can say more about that. But for now, basically what the psychoticism domain captures is the person in touch with reality, or is she prone to excessive fantasy? So again, in speaking with clinicians about this, they sort of seem to resonate with this way of thinking about it, which is that you're not trying to put a person in a category like borderline personality disorder or any of the classical categories. Instead, for anybody you encounter, you're thinking about the functioning in these 5 systems and kind of the profile of the person across their functioning in these 5 systems. And in that way, you can capture the kinds of combinations that one sees clinically that don't necessarily fit neatly into the classical categories. And, in my clinical experience, so originally I was a clinician more than a researcher. I encountered many people who were like that, and that's how I got interested in this, right? And I started to think, well, maybe I should develop a career studying schizopaths, for example. I saw a number of people in settings I was working in who were markedly psychotic, but also extremely aggressive and antagonistic, right? So what is that, right? In other words, they had serious problems with reality testing, but in addition to that, they were very antagonistic, manipulative, and so on, right? So what do you call that? It's not psychopathy, because you miss the psychotic features. It's not schizotypy, because then you miss the psychopathic features. Do you see what I mean? Plenty of people like that were presenting, and were people that I was trying to work with, and they simply do not fit into the classical categories. It's those presentations that are typical, and it's those presentations that can never be captured by these classical, sort of categorical labels. And as I was mentioning, there's evidence that clinicians do resonate with these concepts. So here's some data relevant to that. This is a study that Les Morey did with Andy Skodal and John Oldham, who were the chair and co-chair of the DSM-5 committee, asking about the clinical utility of the concepts that are new to the DSM-5. So is it easy to apply? Can you communicate with other professionals this way? How about talking to the patient about their problems? How about comprehensively describing the problems? What about formulating an effective intervention? And how good are these things at describing the individual's global personality? So these are ratings that were made by clinicians, both psychiatrists and psychologists, on these 6 items of clinical utility. And what you can see is that the DSM-5 concepts were regarded, generally speaking, by the clinicians as more useful than the DSM-4 criteria, but particularly the DSM-5 traits, right? So higher numbers here represent greater degrees of clinical utility as perceived by these practicing clinicians. And the clinicians tended to regard the DSM-5 traits as considerably or statistically significantly more useful than the DSM-4 criteria. Okay. So as Daniel referred to, one sort of artifact, if you will, something that fell out of this process was the development of something called the Personality Inventory for DSM-5, or PID-5. This is a clinical assessment tool that can assess the 5 major systems, which you could think of as personality domains, as well as 25 specific facets within those 5 broad domains. One nice thing is that although the American Psychiatric Association owns this instrument and owns the copyright on it, you can get it for free at dsm5.org, right? So those of you who have computers here, if you were curious, just go to dsm5.org, click on Assessment Instruments, and you can download the PDF of the PID-5 right now, which is nice, right? Because when I teach personality assessment, I'm reminded by my students that if you want to use things like the MMPI or whatever, it costs a fair amount of money to use these instruments. The PID-5, though, is free. At least right now, the APA is making it freely available because I think part of what they're thinking is to try to promote this new approach. It's useful to kind of give away some elements of it for free. The full form contains 220 items and then measures these 25 facets. Something interesting that happened recently is that Josh Miller and some of his colleagues at the University of Georgia have developed a shorter form. So we have a paper in press at Psych Assessment suggesting you can measure the 25 facets with 4 items each, and it's still reasonably reliable. Of course, you're going to lose some reliability relative to the full form, but this paper suggests you don't lose a huge amount. So that's a short form that people might consider if they don't have time for the 220 items. We also developed an informant report form, and I want to make a plug for that. To my way of thinking, informant data is this great undiscovered country, right? Informant data are just incredibly useful for understanding people. Certainly this is true in clinical assessment, right? Relative to, say, trying to use validity scales like LF and K and trying to guess about what the person meant. It's much more useful in my clinical experience to get someone else's viewpoint, right? And then try to triangulate on understanding the person from multiple viewpoints. Right, so my thinking about clinical assessment is much more similar to, say, Tom Achenbach, right, and the ECPA tradition, that what you're trying to do is combine information from different reporters. This is more typical in children, but the problem is exactly the same as adults. It's not like suddenly you turn 18 and you can be trusted about understanding your own personality, right? There is a lot to be learned from other people who know you, and so I would make a plug for trying to get informant data whenever possible. There are numerous translations also available of the PID-5, so since I'm in Europe, I wanted to, mention key European languages. It's been translated successfully into German by Daniel and Johannes Zimmermann and some other colleagues from Germany. We have a paper on that. Andrea Fossati in Italy has been doing a great deal of work with the PID-5. Just this week, a paper appeared on a French translation. I was aware that people were working on it, but I hadn't seen the paper until just this week, so that seemed to work out okay. There's a Dutch translation that Philip de Fruit and Barbara de Klerk have done, as well as I'm aware of a Spanish translation where the paper is, I guess, under review at this point. But those papers tend to show that it has similar psychometric properties in these other languages. Also, we've been working on applications to industrial organizational psychology. Denise Owens is a good friend and colleague of mine at Minnesota, and she's been particularly interested in how the PID-5 might be useful in high-stakes kind of situations. So we're working on reports that might be suitable derived from PID-5 data. Like one thing that's obviously a very important topic right now is things like airline pilots, right? So can we gain additional validity from these more maladaptive traits when we have high-stakes assessment decisions to be made, for these jobs that are very sensitive? So that's something that Denise and I have been working on, and I'm sure she'd be happy also to tell you more about our work in that area. Okay, a little more data. On the extended hierarchical structure. So one thing I've always been interested in, again, Daniel mentioned this, is kind of how personality is organized. And I grew up in this era, right? So I got my PhD in the mid-90s, as he mentioned. So I've been around for a little time, at least. But when I was being trained, there were still these sort of arguments in the literature about the right number of factors, right? And I always thought that was maybe not the right way to frame the problem. So this was still the era in which you would read things like, Ising arguing that there really only are 3 things that matter, and McRae and Costa arguing that there are 5, and other people saying, that openness is an incoherent thing, there's really 4. right? And sort of this argument about the right number of factors. So when we developed the PID-5, one thing I was particularly excited to try to understand is there a coherent hierarchical structure, right? So my thinking has always been that it wasn't that these different levels are correct or incorrect, but rather that the organization of personality has a reliable set of hierarchical features, right? Such that, for example, the Isinghian or Tellegen Big 3 is sitting at a higher level of abstraction than, say, the Costin-McCrae style Big 5. So I wanted to see if we got things like this out of the PID-5. And we did, and I'll show you in a minute what this looks like. So the scales were reliable in this sample. The sample was fairly large in which we did this work. There was good congruence with the sample in which I created the PID-5. And we wanted to examine, again, hierarchical unfolding. So in this case, we used what Lou Goldberg has delightfully called the Bass-Ackwards method. Lou's a good character. He's an enjoyable person to have around. So this kind of approach allows a telescoping kind of approach. So if you think about this kind of psychometric approach in the clinic, right, what this allows is focusing on broad versus narrow features based on clinical demands. So the things I just said to you are fairly psychometric in nature, but if you translate those concepts for use in the clinic, right, the reason you might care about a hierarchy of personality constructs is because sometimes all you really want to know is how disturbed the person is, right? This has been the focus, for example, in the ICD-11 process on very high levels of this hierarchy. Other times, when you have more time, you want more detailed information. And my guess has always been that people's arguments about the right number of factors were misplaced because the hierarchy itself has reliable features. Okay, so anyway, what does this look like in the context of the PID-5? Well, with the PID-5, you do get a legitimate first unrotated principal component. And you get that because the scales are all saturated with negative valence, I think, right? So if you look at the item content of the PID-5, it's all very maladaptive. And so this is not this sort of general factor of personality that Rushton and others have written about, right? That, I think, is a less compelling psychometric construct because it mixes up things of different valence. Here, because everything has negative valence, the scales do have some positive manifold. They tend to be all positively correlated with each other. So if you extract the first component and look at the loading patterns, you will get non-zero loadings on all 25 scales, and that suggests that there's a legitimate general factor. That then bifurcates into more internalizing and externalizing features. And this is similar to what I and other people have written about in the broader psychopathology literature, right? That mental disorders generally divide into more internalizing presentations, things like anxiety and depression, more externalizing presentations, things like antisocial behavior, acting out, using substances in a problematic way, and so on. Then at the three-factor level, internalizing in this data set divides into the detachment and negative affect features. So at the three-factor level, you get something very similar to what Ising and Tellegen wrote about, right? Ising called this psychoticism, which I think many of us would now agree is a misnomer. But, you know, this is very similar to Ising's Penn model, to Tellegen's sort of Big 3 model, where you have something that's like neuroticism, something that's like introversion extroversion, and then something that's, you know, similar to Isinghian psychoticism. At the four-factor level, then, externalizing divides into two features, something more like antagonism, right, acting out, hurting other people on purpose, something more like disinhibition, being careless and sloppy and not showing up for things and so on. This level, then, looks a lot like, say, what John Livesley's DAP model looks like, or other four-factor models in the personality pathology literature. Then at the fifth level is where psychoticism emerges as a separate component, right? So the point of this kind of approach is it's not like the three-factor theorists are right and the five-factor theorists are wrong and so on and so forth. Rather, I think these different theorists have instruments that sample from the variable space in different ways. And it's the nature of that sampling that determines which level of the hierarchy can be extracted meaningfully from particular instruments. With the PID-5, it seems there's evidence here that all the levels can be extracted, and you can get a meaningful hierarchy of constructs at different levels of specificity and generality. Okay. Being an American, I want to say a little bit about connections with the National Institute of Mental Health RDoC project, which I think people have probably heard about in Europe as well. This is a fascinating little political thing that's happened in the United States. It used to be the case that the National Institute of Mental Health, which funds psychopathology research, and the American Psychiatric Association were the phrase in English would be in cahoots, right? Which means sort of like secretly they were sort of sneaking around, trying to cooperate with each other in a sort of way of creating a monopoly, right? So you see the idea. And that's how it worked in the United States for a long time. They were sort of in bed with each other is another phrase I could use, right? And that's how it was. But now, in the current era, the director of the NIMH and the people who were in charge of the DSM-5 came to loggerheads, right? So they came to a serious kind of disagreement. And NIMH went its own direction, right? And said, we don't care anymore about your made-up psychiatric categories. And they actually said that on a blog, right? And so Tom Insel, the director of NIMH, has a blog, you know, where you go online and say what you're thinking off the cuff. And he said things in there like, fictional psychiatric categories are no longer the focus of NIMH. Very provocative language. He got in a fair amount of trouble for that, but nevertheless, they're still going in this direction of saying we don't care anymore about these psychiatric categories. We want to do our own system. And we want to focus very specifically on neuroscience. So that's been a very provocative thing they've said. Now, speaking for myself, my way of thinking about this situation is that you can't just do neuroscience and genetics by itself because you have to connect it back to the things that you can assess using traditional assessment instruments. So NIMH has been less focused on that kind of thing, right? So when they describe how they want you to approach the study of psychopathology, they focus on these 5 broad domains, but the language they use to describe the domains is the language of cognitive neuroscience, not the language of, say, assessment psychology. So they call these domains negative valence, which is similar to the negative affect domain we've been talking about, positive valence, which is similar to introversion, and then these 3 other domains that really aren't individual differences domains, right? They're not talking here about individual differences necessarily. They're talking more about faculties of the mind, right? So sort of things that the brain or the mind does, right? And so when they talk about cognition, they mean systems that are relevant to being able to have cognition, right? So to think. Systems that are relevant to social processes and systems that are relevant to arousal and regulation, without really thinking about the idea that there are individual differences in these systems, right? They're more saying, we want people to study underlying brain circuits, right? They love that kind of language, right? We want brain circuits to define mental illness. But, Tim Truel and Tom Whittaker sort of wrote about this very early on, about this idea, which I very much resonate with myself, that really you can think about these RDoC domains as being very similar to abnormal versions of the big 5 domains. So negative affect and detachment, which fall in that broad internalizing category, are similar to negative valence and positive valence. When you think, what are psychotic problems, right? They're really problems with thinking. Plenty of people have called the psychoticism domain thought disorder. So that seems like a reasonable similarity to emphasize. Social processes, when gone awry, result in antagonism, and problems with regulation might be thought of as disinhibitory. So what I think is that to make something like RDoC work, where you have to connect these ideas in neuroscience to these ideas in assessment, right? You have to pull these things together. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road and where the exciting science will occur. Not so much in working on neuroscience alone by itself, abstracted from clinical concerns. Rather, it's the interweaving of these things that I think is going to get us someplace. So that's something I've tried to write about. I've tried to learn more about neuroscience myself. My colleague at Minnesota, Angus MacDonald, is an outstanding neuroscientist himself, so I've been fortunate that he doesn't mind me bugging him about these things. And we worked on a special section of the Journal of Abnormal a couple years ago that you might take a look at if you're interested in this, because we got some of the RDoC people who work for NIMH to talk about these ideas and seem to get them on paper saying similar things. So that's something you might find interesting. Okay, then I promised a little bit of genetics, because this is another area that I work in. I promise I won't take up too much time with this, but I'm very excited about these findings. So one thing I've worked on in recent years is trying to find genetic variants that are associated with mental illnesses, and that's been extremely frustrating. And those of you who know this literature know what I'm talking about. And so the question has been, why has this been so difficult to do? Well, my argument, or what people have convinced me of, or I guess what my experiences have convinced me, is that this kind of approach, genome-wide association, right, so looking at genetic variants across the genome will work, but we need much, much larger samples than we originally anticipated because each genomic variant accounts for a trivial percentage of the differences among people. This is what Sir Ronald Fisher said back in the early 1900s, right? So Fisher, who was really one of the most brilliant biometricians who ever lived, sort of had this model about how to reconcile Mendelian genetics with the existence of continuous variation. And that works if there's a lot of different variants that are very small. So it's sort of Fisher's curse, if you will. Or something like Fisher was actually right. He was, I think, correct about how this would work. But what it means for us is that we need very, very big samples to find these things. It will help if we have continuous measurement, right? To get back to my theme about dimensionality. That's because each individual effect is probably very small. Excuse me. But if you add them up, I think they will predict non-trivial variance, and that's why we see heritability of personality in twin studies, for example. So this kind of work is moving toward very large consortia, and the thing that I wanted to share with you today, because I find this exciting, is we recently published a paper that finds a credible hit for neuroticism, and you can see that in JAMA Psychiatry, just came out very recently. But to find a single hit for neuroticism required over 63,000 people in the discovery sample. And I'm also convinced that that's a little too small, right, based on the size of the effects that we're seeing for the things that we think are meaningful. We really need samples of about 300,000 people. And again, this is because every individual single nucleotide polymorphism, right, every difference between people at the level of the nucleotides has a very small effect. But in aggregate, they matter, and there are going to be thousands of these things, I think, that are going to be relevant to some continuous dimension like personality. And we're starting to produce evidence that's compatible with what I just said, working with things like educational attainment. So in studying educational attainment, which is a phenotype you can study easily in very large samples, we've got maybe 74 or so of these SNPs in a paper that's under review at Nature that seem to be very real. So, and you see this in medicine too, when people have studied complex, common late-life disorders, right, like type 2 diabetes. This discovery has accelerated once the sample sizes started to breach 100,000 people in discovery. So my argument is for things like personality, we'll get to the same place if we can continue to build the scientific resources necessary to understand these multiple very small variants. So in any case, in this particular paper, we did find, I think for the first time, a very credible hit for neuroticism. This polymorphism is in a gene called MAGI1. That's a gene previously implicated in other mental disorders. And there's evidence from expression data that is expressed specifically in neuronal tissue, particularly in the hippocampus. Right, so in this case, the hit was statistically significant, but also biologically plausible. Just to show you a little bit of data from the paper, this is something that's called a Manhattan plot, because when you look at it across the whole genome, it looks like a series of tall buildings. And this is this region of the MAGI1 gene, which is on chromosome 3. These are the p-values of the SNPs in this region. This is the one that was genome-wide significant. Right, so that has a significance, a p-value of 10 to the minus 8, roughly, which is what you need because you have 1 million of these variants. There are so many SNPs that characterize differences among people that when you run that many tests, you need a very small p-value to say that something is significant. That's another reason why we need very, very large sample sizes. In any case, in this case, that's significant, and these ones are suggestive of significance in the same region, which is another nice thing to see because it suggests there's something important about this region and variation in this region as relevant to the trait of neuroticism. Okay. So I'll summarize some thoughts, and then we can chat for a little bit. I think I'm roughly on time. So to my way of thinking, empirical research on personality yields meaningful and useful concepts for the clinic and for biological inquiry. And I would argue that having something dimensional like the alternative model in DSM-5 is a good step in this direction. Thinking about this as a clinician, I believe dimensions make sense of clinical phenomena that are otherwise very puzzling, right? And as I described to you, at least my clinical experiences had to do with wanting to use the DSM successfully, right? Feeling like that would be good because then I would be doing my job well as a clinician, but often encountering frustration because patients just don't look like that, right? They aren't easily sort of pigeonholed or fit into these kind of categories. So I think dimensions work better in the clinic because they provide a way of understanding heterogeneity and of conceptualizing complex kinds of presentations, which are very typically seen in the clinic. That kind of dimensional approach is more informative than just saying the person doesn't fit and giving them an NOS diagnosis. DSM-5 contains things that clearly move in this direction, and I hope that the next steps, right, in going in this direction are to foster the movement by showing what personality science, right, the things that psychologists have worked on, historically, can bring to the study of mental health. Okay, thanks very much. I believe there's time for some questions, if people have any.
Yes, we will come to your microphone if you have any.
Yeah.
It's me again, sorry. It has been remarked on numerous times that there's quite a bit of redundancy within the new DSM-5 system in terms of doing the same thing being coded as part of the Criterion A and also as part of the Criterion B. What do you think would be the next steps that have to be taken in order to get rid of that?
Yeah, this is a good question. So hopefully everybody heard the question, but what Daniel's asking about is, and as I described it, in the new system there's Criterion A and Criterion B. Criterion A is supposed to be more about functioning of personality, and Criterion B is supposed to be more about personality content. But not surprisingly, when people have tried to study this empirically, functioning and content are correlated with each other. And oftentimes they contain much the same kind of information. So to explain my thinking about it, I do have to tell you a bit about the politics of this, right? So it makes some conceptual sense to talk about functioning as separate from sort of traits or content. But really the way Criterion A and Criterion B got created is that different parts of the work group needed something that they could say was their own, right? So I was working on this trait stuff, right? And the people who sort of weren't as much interested in that wanted something much more psychodynamic, right? So they wanted something that had the flavor of psychodynamic thinking about what personality pathology is, right? So I'm talking about authors like Krueger and so on, how they've described personality pathology. And that really led them to articulate this levels of functioning that then constitutes Criterion A. So then when push came to shove, right, when it became necessary to put together a model, for them to have a piece of it, they kind of had to have their piece. And for the traits to get in there, we had to sort of have the trait piece too. And it's not, conceptually totally incoherent, I think, to talk about functioning and traits. But Daniel's right. There have been a number of studies now trying to measure Criterion A and then measuring Criterion B with things like the PID-5, and they're very highly correlated. So then how do we move forward? Well, many people would argue that empirically traits are sufficient, right? Really what you need are these maladaptive tendencies measured. And then that's enough to cover a lot of personality pathology. The challenge, of course, with going that direction is how then do you delineate the level of functioning that's sufficient to justify clinical concern? You see what I mean? Like you have to say something about how severe it has to be concerned, even in some system like that. And you could make it something simple, like the person is not doing well at work or school, right? And that would be somewhat more separable from the traits themselves because it has a different kind of content. But I think you would need something like Criterion A for clinical application. You need something that describes social and occupational dysfunction, right? Because it's that combination of abnormal variation with social and occupational dysfunction that defines a disorder as a concept that's separate from just human variation. So I think something simpler than Criterion A, more focused on social and occupational functioning, will work better because it won't contain so much personality content that overlaps so much with Criterion B. So.
Do we have time for some more questions? Yep.
Do you think we're opening a Pandora's box in terms of when we're mapping these things onto genomes, in terms of people copping out and that it's not their fault if they do something wrong because it's genetic?
Oh, that's a great question. So everybody heard that question, right? The question was, so I predicted that when we get large enough sample sizes, we will have reliable associations between genomic variants and human personality. And you suggested, this lady suggested, that that would be a problem in forensic sorts of situations because a clever lawyer would say, look at this paper that Krueger and all those guys published, right? So you, the judge and jury, like my argument is that my patient is just like this. It's their genetics that cause this. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to see play out. But my guess is that few judges and juries would find that argument totally convincing, right? Even if there are genetic associations that predict human variation, I think in forensic settings or in a court of law, it'd be difficult to make the argument that therefore the person has no capacity with that. And what we often see in this kind of genetic research is that there's a lot of moderation of genetic effects by social policy, right? So you see the idea, right? And we show this in the educational attainment paper. It's really interesting what we, I think, showed there. Genetic effects at a molecular level on educational attainment are stronger for older people there. You see the idea? And I think what that's about is that social policies have changed in the later part of the 20th century to emphasize more equal access to education. Right? So there's evidence in there that as you change social policy, you can change the way genetic factors impact the manifest phenotypes. So there's this interplay always between people and their dispositions and their genotypes and the way in which society is structured. And I think as we continue to do this research, there will be lots of examples of how these things work. And the reason I think that is that in population genetics with animals, that's what it looks like. Right? There's nothing like a fixed heritability in that literature. Right? If you look at the heritability of physical characteristics of animals, for example, you can shift that around dramatically by the circumstances that the animals encounter. A classic example is famine, for example. Right? You're studying a bird population. The heritability is something in this situation. Then there's a famine. Right? There's some disease that kills the berries that the birds eat, for example. Suddenly the genetic variation goes way up because some birds are hardier than others. But when there's lots of access to food, the genetic variation is less. Do you see what I'm saying? It's got to work the same way for humans. But what we have yet to illustrate are good empirical examples of that. So I suspect as we discover more of those genomic variants, we'll have lots of good empirical examples of how genetic variation is shaped by social circumstances. And so that will be a subtlety that the scientific literature will contain. But I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to how it's going to play out in course. But if I was on the jury, I wouldn't buy that argument. It's just not compatible with, I don't know, Western jurisprudence, right? We have this idea in Western cultures that people can take a fair amount of responsibility for their own behavior as adults in spite of the fact that, we differ from each other and have different social backgrounds and different, personalities and so on. So I wouldn't buy it as a juror. I don't know if you guys would, right? This is just because of this person's genes. I just don't think it'll work well in a court of law.
Yeah, I think there was another one somewhere. Yep.
Hi. In IO psychology, we usually shy away from clinical measures. So I was wondering if you can tell a bit more about the study you were doing with Denise Owens.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Again, I'm not an IO psychologist, but I do have friends who are IO psychologists. And what they tell me is that it's okay to use more of these measures post-offer, right? So they say that once the offer has been made and you have a very sensitive kind of job, then you can start to use more abnormal range things for access to sensitive positions. So I think that's how she's suggesting this might be used. So at that next phase, you might be able to use this kind of thing for selection. So I think that's their thinking about how to make this work legally. And then speaking for myself, the scientifically interesting thing is I bet you'd pick up some additional variants. That's my bet. These things go into a fairly abnormal range. If you look at the item content of the PID5, I would argue that it's much darker than what's on something like the NEO. Right? So the psychoticism content literally talks about, hearing the voices of people who aren't there. That content is not on the NEO, right? I mean, not to make fun of the NEO. I hate to do that, because the five-factor stuff is so important. It's so critical to personality structure. But really, the item content of things like the NEO, a better example is the BFI. You guys know the BFI? Look at the item content of the BFI. It's very, the word I've been using in English is milquetoast. So milquetoast is this thing you feed to kids because it's very mushy and they can't digest anything tasty, right? And the BFI has this kind of item content that's very bland, whereas something like the PID5 has much more serious item content, my guess is that that makes a difference for predicting more serious problems, right? So for finding people who are truly aggressive and have difficulty constraining those impulses, that's going to be better than sometimes I disagree with people, right? Like that kind of item content, right? So I suspect that the abnormal measures will have some validity for these kind of post-offer situations. And so that's why I've been working with Denise on how to use this thing in these selection settings.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Time is over. Thank you.
Thanks.